introducing the contractually obliged public lecture by the István Deák visiting professor of East Central European Studies, who is Daniel Pratt here to my right, who is going to be giving today's talk. When he's not here, he's assistant professor of Slavic cultures at McGill University, where he works on Czech, Polish, Russian, Austrian, and Hungarian literature and culture. His interests include narratology, dissent, nationality studies, aesthetics, and the intersection of literature and philosophy. He has 2 book projects currently in the hopper, the first of which you're going to hear about today. The title of that project, Against Narrative, Non-Narrative Constructions of Temporality in Central Europe. And the other project, Bruno Jasenski, Internationalist. Besides these big projects, he has written on Czechoslovak dissident punk rock, Gombrovich's interaction with Gilles Deleuze, and also on the meaning of history in Central Europe, among other topics. We're really glad to have Daniel with us this semester, teaching 2 great courses for us in the Slavic department and giving us this talk.
Great. Thank you, Chris. And thank you all for being here. It's already been an amazing experience to be here at the Harriman and at Columbia more broadly. And it's been great to be able to take advantage of the intellectual community here. Today, I'm going to be presenting what is effectively a first stab at a book talk, because this is the book that I am finishing up at the moment. So it might be a little bit premature because I haven't published the book yet, but nonetheless, this is kind of what I'm getting at. And the topic, as Chris has pointed out, is this problem of narrative in Central Europe. And I'm going to focus predominantly on Olga Tokarczuk and the role that she plays in this book. But before I get to her, I'm actually going to start a little bit differently. And I think there's another text that's going to help us kind of get into this problem that I'm trying to talk about. And so I'll start with Karl Čapek's 1934 novel, Obyčejný život, An Ordinary Life, the 3rd part of his so-called noetic trilogy. And this contains the autobiography of an unnamed retired railroad clerk, bookended by the discussions of his friends who read the work posthumously. After a minor heart attack, the clerk, a consummate bureaucrat, decides he needs to put his things in order. He recounts his various successes and failures from childhood to the contemporary moment, presumably close to the year that Čapek finished the work, finding that his life was only, quote, a quiet, obvious, and almost mechanical sequence of days and years. It was a good straight road on which it was impossible to go astray. He grew up in a small town in Bohemia, succeeded in school, was admitted to college, but subsequently dropped out, became a clerk for the railroads, married the daughter of a station master, committed a few deeds of petty heroism during the war, and became an administrator of the new Ministry of Railroads in Prague afterwards. Little extraordinary has occurred in the unnamed clerk's life, and it appears the novel will live up to the rather unremarkable title. But about halfway through the novel, the clerk finishes his story, leaving the reader to question why there are so many pages left. The narrator discovers another voice in him that, without changing any of the facts of his life, tells a really different story, emphasizing his pride, spite, and ambitiousness. The 2 voices begin to argue over which perspective on the story is correct. But then a 3rd voice interrupts, creating another version with the same facts, emphasizing the clerk's hypochondria. And then another voice pipes in, and another, and another, and another, until there are 8 different voices with the potential of several more, all staking a claim to the life, disrupting the idea of having a single, continuous story. The clerk discovers that each voice offers something of a continuous story, but there must be so many odd things to be thrown aside. Each voice develops its own narrative of the clerk's life, some complete from birth to death, others that only make sense of the clerk's life for a small section of time. Although Čapek's novel and stories were written 30 to 40 years before, it can be read as a challenge to the narrative construction of selfhood and temporality advocated by Bernie Williams, Paul Ricoeur, Jerome Bruner, Alistair MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, and many, many, many others, who have claimed that humans understand time ineluctably through narrative. And this group I'm going to call the narrativists. Ricoeur begins his 3-volume investigation into narrative, time, and narrative by claiming time becomes human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of a narrative. Narrative, in turn, is meaningful to the extent that it portrays the features of temporal experience. Taylor argues we cannot but strive to give our lives meaning or substance, and that this means that we understand ourselves inescapably in narrative. Bruner writes, we seem to have no other way of describing lived time save in the form of narrative. Their argument, to put it somewhat simply, is that because stories are so prevalent in and across cultures, that we may claim that stories are a part of what it means to be human. Stories are the way we as humans understand time because they put order on the manifold of temporal experience. It's kind of Kantian terminology here. Additionally, narratives, because they create causal relationships between agents and actions, form the foundation of ethics. And so narratives are not only a description of time, but also the only ethical way of understanding time, or so at least the narrativists argue. Čapek's novella, however, demonstrated some of the fundamental problems with the narrative conception of self and temporality. First of all, he disputes that there can be a single continuous story of a life, even when looking back on one's life. This is the so-called obituary position from Peter Brooks. Secondly, the unnamed clerk initially develops a rather moral depiction of his life, minimizing his sins, if not always maximizing his virtues. This means effectively that the narrativization process here allows us to look better to both ourselves and to others, to not necessarily take responsibility, shedding some doubts on this ethical construction. The second voice, of course, does the opposite, but this shows that problem with the ethical evaluation. Finally, Čapek's narrator reveals parts of the story that are disconnected from the underlying narrative. There are moments that simply do not make sense in any continuous narrative of a life of an ordinary man, or an ambitious man, or a hypochondriac. Instead, Čapek's very ordinary man contains multitudes, each part trying to gain the upper hand for even a moment. These objections to the narrative construction of selfhood resemble Galen Strawson's in his 2004 article Against Narrativity. Strawson shed doubt on both the descriptive and normative position, that is the ethical position here, and advanced his so-called episodic self-construction as an alternative, a term that he later turned to impermanentist in his book Selves. In addition to himself, Strawson cites several authors who purportedly support an episodic understanding of time, and the article caused quite an uproar in the narratologist community, with several articles emerging in response. But as of now, the reaction to Strawson's article has by and large focused on redeeming the narrative approach or attempting to invalidate Strawson's position. In defending their turf, both the narrativists and the episodics, or so I call Strawson and his few defenders, have referred to literary examples, either as paradigms or as illustrations of narrative or non-narrative constructions. On the one hand, the narrativists refer to Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time and Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea. And on the other, Strawson counts Montaigne, Stendhal, Fernando Pessoa, and Robert Musil amongst the episodics. This final example, Robert Musil, is particularly useful, since Ricoeur addresses Musil's magnum opus, Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, or The Man Without Qualities, claiming, in the case of Robert Musil, the disintegration of narrative form parallel to the loss of identity of the character exceeds the limit of narrative and draws the work closer to the essay. Ulrich, the main character of the novel, ultimately has no personal identity according to Ricoeur because of this lack of narrative. And the result is an essay instead of a novel about an individual. However, Strawson quotes Goran Rees, claiming, for myself, it would be impossible to tell the story of his life because at no time in my life had I the enviable sensation of constituting a continuous personality, going back to this idea of continuity. As a child, this did not worry me. And if indeed I had known at the time of the man without qualities, I would have greeted him as my blood brother and rejoiced because I was not alone in the world. Musil then is held up as a positive example for the episodics and a negative one for the narrativists. The problem with both approaches, despite their reliance on literary sources, lies in their lack of a rigorous definition of narrative. Neither Strawson nor the narrativists are careful with how they delimit the scope of what counts as a narrative and what does not, resulting in what James Phelan, the longtime editor of the journal Narrative, has called narrative imperialism. In other words, this idea that narrative is everywhere and that everything ultimately is a narrative. But the problem with this is that then it becomes so broad as to mean very little. I mean, you can see that if narrative is as weak as Gérard Genet's provocation that I walk, Pierre has come, are for me only minimal forms of narrative. And inversely, the Odyssey and In Search of Lost Time are only, in a certain way, an amplification of the rhetorical sense of statements such as Ulysses comes home to Ithaca, or Marcel becomes a writer. And I love this idea that we could, take all 7 tomes of In Search of Lost Time and just be like, well, Marcel becomes a writer. It's effectively the same thing. But if this is how broadly we define narrative, then it means little more than we define narrative as speech. That's really all that's here. And if that's all that's there, then this narrativist perception of what is, temporality just means that we express our temporal experience through language. And if that's the case, it's hard to object to this idea. But on the other hand, we could have a much stronger perception of what narrative is, such as that of David Pallauer, who's a translator and disciple of Ricoeur. And he claims that narrative implots what it says. In a non-trivial sense, what is at issue here is that narratives, at least well-formed ones, and notice here the normative claim in here, have a beginning, middle, and end. And if this is the case, then the narrative's position is both much stronger and much more questionable. And I might add here, much more normative. The problem with such a strong definition of narrative lies in how we create those narratives out of the manifold of experience, to return to my Kantian terminology here. Narratives are effectively placed on the world in order to organize our temporal existence. But in that process, we must exclude a great deal in order to create such a narrative, as we see in Čapek's example. In writing on history and narrative, the analytic philosopher Arthur C. Danto claims that history is expressed in significant narratives. Each part relies on earlier elements to tell a story that has significance through its pragmatic, theoretical, consequential, or revelatory structure. History contains only those elements which develop the story, creating a unified whole. Each narrative, he says, would ideally want to include only those things relevant to some other events or significant to them. The quality of the historical narrative, then, relies on the amount of insignificant detail. For Danto, a good historian builds a narrative around the facts and then discards all that insignificant detail. The question, of course, is what's insignificant? The philosopher of history and historian in his own right, Hayden White, argues that not only do historians use narratives to implot historical works, but that they also use particular tropes to do so. Historians, for White, use narrative tropes, the comic, tragic, romantic, and ironic forms, and these are things he borrows from Northrop Frye, to create a communicable narrative of the past. The historian then engages in matching up a specific plot structure with the set of historical events that he wishes to endow with a meaning of a particular kind. The result is, quote, essentially a literary, that is a fiction-making operation. Historical events in and of themselves do not carry meaning. It is only through putting them into a plot that the meaning emerges. That meaning is created not by the facts themselves, but by the historian who implots them. The historian omits events as insignificant because they do not fit a ready-made plot. The danger here is clear, that if the narrative becomes more important than the facts available, then the narrative could skew away from a representation of reality. As the famous journalistic saying goes, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But this issue of plot brings us back to literature. I do not want to go as far as White to suggest that there are only 4 narrative tropes available to us, although I do believe that there are a few types of narratives that we rely on more than others. Nonetheless, if we buy into White's idea that we apply the forms of narrative that we have at our disposal to both history on the large scale and our own lives on the smaller one, then literature and storytelling activities more generally play an enormous role with how we understand the world around us. Authors who create new forms of literature are not just playing with forms, but potentially offering new ways for us to understand time more generally. Thus, new structural forms can be more than just postmodern play, despite the objections of a number of theorists. For example, in his influential article, The Myth of the Postmodern Breakthrough, Gerald Graff finds a distrust of historical analysis to be part of the postmodern. And this is, of course, a kind of a standard phrase. I mean, we see this in Lyotard as well. But Graff claims, whereas modernists such as James Eliot and Wallace Stevens turn to art, defined as the imposition of human order upon inhuman chaos. You can see basically it's the same idea of that what narrative does, is that it puts an order on this inhuman chaos as an antidote for that immense panorama of futility and anarchy, which is contemporary history, as Eliot called this age. The postmodernists have recognized that under such conceptions of art and history, it makes no sense to regard as providing any more consolation than any other discredited cultural institution, secular or religious. Postmodernism signifies that the nightmare of history, as modernism defined it, has overtaken modernism itself. For if history is seen as the unintelligible flux of phenomena, again, the manifold here, lacking an inherent significance and structure, then no exertions of the shaping, ordering imagination can be anything but a dishonest refuge from the truth. Now, again, I don't go as far as Graff does here, saying that all patterns are flawed, but I would agree that the problems he's pointing to here are ones that narrative has. That we could take this all out and say, this is the problem of narrative in itself. But instead of relying only on narrative, and particularly on this strong definition, we need to find new types of storytelling that allow us to see the world in a new way, ones that even function as new mimetic forms. And this idea brings me to Olga Tokarczuk and her concepts of the constellation novel and the tender narrative. In her Nobel lecture of 2019, and she won in 2018, but there was a scandal at the Nobel Prize committee, and so it was delayed by a year. But she addresses this issue of storytelling explicitly, claiming that how we think about the world, and perhaps even more importantly, how we narrate it, have a massive significance. A thing that happens and is not told ceases to exist and perishes. This is a fact well known not only to historians, but also, perhaps above all, to every stripe of politician and tyrant. He who has and weaves the story is in charge. With this remark, Tokarczuk was trying to challenge some of the ways that the last Polish government attempted to control the narrative of history. By the way, how nice is it to say the last Polish government?
I know. I voted Saturday. I'm a Polish citizen, but I don't hold my breath.
That's fair. That's fair. First step has been made. So I'm not going to make any kind of predictions here. I don't want to narrativize anything, far from it, but at least one step. But of course we know that one of the things that peace has done is it attempted to control the narrative of history, trying to put Poland in a particularly positive light, always as either hero or victim of history, never a perpetrator. But Tokarczuk here, I think, is also confronting the problem of narrative. She sees narrative itself as a problem because of how it can be used by politicians to mislead the public through omission. She does not just distrust one particular narrative that the politicians and tyrants present, but rather Tokarczuk sheds doubt on linear narratives as a whole, being aware of the, quote, pitfalls of linear storytelling. Tokarczuk finds that the standard stories, and I believe here that she means those linear narratives, are not sufficient to describe our lived experience. In that same lecture, she claims, today our problem lies, it seems, in the fact that we do not yet have ready narratives, not only for the future, but even for a concrete now, for the ultra-rapid transformations of today's world. We lack the language, we lack the points of view, the metaphors, the myths, and new fables. Yet we do see frequent attempts to harness rusty, anachronistic narratives that cannot fit the future to imaginaries of the future. No doubt on the assumption that an old something is better than a new nothing. We're trying in this way to deal with the limitations of our own horizons. In a word, we lack new ways of telling the story of the world. The major problem for Tokarczuk is actually the proliferation of first-person narratives, which on the one hand has yielded a great number of stories, but on the other, it has created a world without connection, where each person claims to be the hero of their own story. Such narrativization results in false heroes, and it does more to atomize us than to bring us closer together. In the place of such atomizing narratives, Tokarczuk sees a new opening in the renewed interest in series. For her, the series' influence on the modes of storytelling and the world, and therefore on our way of understanding that story too, is revolutionary. Instead of having just a single narrative, the series multiplies the threads, interweaving them in the most improbable manner, so that so much so that when at a loss, it even harks back to the old narrative technique, once comprised by classical opera of the Deus ex machina. The creation of new episodes often entails the total ad hoc overhaul of the psychology of the characters, so that it would be better suited to the developing events of the plot. A character who begins as gentle and reserved winds up vindictive and violent. A supporting character turns protagonist, while the main character to whom we have already grown attached loses significance or actually completely disappears, much to our dismay. I think we have lots of examples of this kind of this series. We have a lot of these on television in particular, and you can think about how much of, say, prestige television now revolves around this kind of form. And we see the ways that major characters will get killed off. They'll just die, or they'll change, or they'll become minor characters in the background. And this, as opposed to being something that we should find frustrating, is actually a new way of trying to mimic the world that we live in, where this is the way that things actually happen, where sometimes we are not actually the true heroes of even our own story. So no single character is more important than continuation of the series. And heroes become villains, or even worse, lose all significance whatsoever. This, for Tokarczuk, represents a higher mimetic form than the narrative structures employed today. In terms of the written word, however, Tokarczuk advocates for her own constellation novel, with Bieguni, or Flights, as the prime example. This novel contains 116 short passages with some overlap in characters and topics, but largely the passages exist on their own without any obvious connective tissue. The novel includes sections on the narrator's life, which looks a lot like Tokarczuk's, although we should be careful to distinguish the two. There's a man searching for his lost wife and child while on vacation in Croatia. It's the story of the 17th century Dutch anatomist, Philip Verheyen, who discovered the Achilles tendon by dissecting his own amputated leg. And of course, there are the titular runners, or bieguni in Polish, a sect of Orthodox old believers who believe that motion is divine. In one section, a travel psychologist addresses the idea of constellationality directly in a lecture, claiming that the foundational idea is constellationality. In life, unlike in studies, although in fact in scholarship too, much gets overtaxed for the sake of order, there exists no philosophical primal. That means it's impossible to build a consistent cause and effect course of argument, or a narrative with events that succeed each other causistically and follow from each other. That would merely be an approximation, in the same way that an approximation of the Earth gives us a grid of latitude and longitude, when in reality, in order to reflect our experience more accurately, it would be necessary to assemble a whole out of pieces of more or less the same size, placed concentrically on the same surface. Constellation, not sequencing, carries truth. Instead of relying on causal sequencing, that is, this strong narrative, Tokarczuk argues for a series of connected fragments whose totality creates the constellation. Going back to her Nobel Prize speech, Tokarczuk explains the significance of these fragments, arguing that perhaps we should trust fragments, as it is fragments that create constellations capable of describing more and in a more complex way, multidimensionality. Our stories could refer to one another in an infinite way, and their central characters could enter into relationships with each other. This web of connections, something akin to Deleuze's construction of the rhizo, creates a new construction of temporality that does not need narrative in the strongest sense. Moreover, Tokarczuk here is arguing for a greater mimetic role that fragments and the constellation novel can play in our understanding the world around us. Narrative, for Tokarczuk, fails to adequately describe our lived experience, whereas the constellation novel can help us make sense of the complexities and interconnectedness of our contemporary world. The resulting novelistic form defies what Danto has argued for in terms of the historical narrative. Instead of paring down the narrative to the most significant elements, Tokarczuk's work overflows with asides and digressions. And Benjamin Payloff has noticed this, the abundance of the extraneous in Tokarczuk's work as a way of challenging standard narrative practices. He argues that on the level of speech, Tokarczuk creates a reality of unforeseen outcomes and unpredictable interactions. And that reflects the reality more closely. Again, we're getting back to this idea of its mimetic forms than any pre-formulated and strictly delimited plot-driven novel can. Strong narrative novel can. She creates this reality by having speakers who frequently project that they themselves are unaware why they are telling us what they are telling us. The narrators have not yet picked what is important or what is essential to the plot as in Dante's description of the historical narrativization. But rather, the narrators leave the speech as it is for us as the readers to determine what is important. For Palov, this openness comes from the psychotherapeutic listening, and Tokarczuk is famously trained as a psychoanalyst, because the therapist listens while trying to hold off preconceptions of what to listen for. Instead of having the narrator dictate what is important from the very beginning, Tokarczuk allows the reader to piece together the elements that tie together her novels. By offering an overabundance of information without the guidepost to help the reader decide what is important, the novels take on the shape of a novel in which no single plot line presents itself to the reader as dominant. And so here again, we can see this relationship to the idea of the series. Each smaller plot line becomes a part of the larger constellation, whose outline is decided upon by the reader, not by the author, who only provides the initial points, but none of the numbers of a connect the dots image. The meaning-making structure of the constellation novel, thus, is collaborative, a work that exists between the author and reader, not one simply applied to the world as an author. But the assemblage of stories is not random, and each of Tokarczuk's constellation novels focuses on a particular theme that connects the stories together. House of Day, House of Night examines the problem of borders, breaking down a variety of them, from national borders to the borders between life and death. Flights is guided by the connection that travel engenders. And in that novel, Tokarczuk emphasizes that stasis has never been the natural state of human beings. In the books of Jacob Frank holds the central position in that narrative, even if he is by no means the protagonist of the novel. And in some ways, one of the ways that we can think about that novel is the way that people make sense of who Jacob Frank is. And so he stands at the center, but there's this perspectives all kind of around him on what it actually means to be, what he means to the rest of the people. And that is a more important element than Jacob Frank in his own right. The real ties that bind the novels together lie, though, in the narrative voice of the novel. That is this tender narrator, the title of Tokarczuk's Nobel Prize lecture. In that lecture, Tokarczuk introduces her understanding of the tender narrator with a story about her mother. As a child, Tokarczuk found an image of her mother before she had become a mother, and Tokarczuk noticed a kind of sadness in her mother's eyes. When asked about that sadness, her mother responded that she missed Olga even before she had been born. This gave the young Tokarczuk the notion that her existence was, quote, beyond the ordinary materiality of the world, beyond chance, beyond cause and effect, and the laws of the probability. Quote. By placing Tokarczuk's existence out of time in the sweet vicinity of eternity, her non-religious mother became a tender narrator. Tokarczuk's tender narrator stands outside of time in an almost religious way. Her second example is the narrator who saw God creating the world in Genesis and who, quote, knows what God thought. Big narrator. And each of Tokarczuk's novels, her constellation novels, starting with House of Day, House of Night, begin with the narrator's opening statement. In House of Day, House of Night, the narrator begins with a dream in which she was pure sight without body or a name. This disembodied narrator looks down at the world and can see everything, even if there was no such thing as I for this narrator. This narrator can see across space, but also through time as well, meaning that there was no before or after, no sense of anticipation, because there was nothing to gain or lose. From this position, the tender narrator can see everything, but she has no stake in the outcome of the story. This kind of disinterestedness, I think, is really important. No one story can take precedence of the others, but rather the totality of the events is the main theme. The narrator of Flights begins in a similar way, with remembering a moment of childhood when, left unsupervised for a bit, the narrator confronts the limit of the world. At that border, my own presence is the only thing with a distinct outline now, an outline that quivers and undulates, and in so doing hurts. All of a sudden I know there's nothing for it now. Here I am. The existence of the narrator allows everything else to be seen, but it's from a position that does not matter other than by existing. There's a simultaneous fullness of being and an annihilation of that being. This form reaches an apogee in the books of Jacob, in which Yenta, who's this sort of fourth person narrator, becomes a kind of living dead, and she sees everything from above. Herself, the balding top of Old Shore's head, in the struggle with her body has lost his cap. And this is how it is now, how it will be. Yenta sees all. And Yenta here stands outside of time and space, above the world, in an almost divine status. And because Tokarczuk uses quasi-religious language to describe the tender narrator, it can be tempting to see her concept as religious or metaphysical at the very least. However, Tokarczuk's novels never delve into that kind of religious belief. They're often about religion. I mean, the books of Jacob being a prime example, but the books themselves never push a particularly religious line. Instead, they rely on the assumption that the world is connected, that people, beings, and environment connect in a way that is impossible to disentangle. She claims the tender narrator has, quote, a perspective from where everything can be seen. Seeing everything, do I have this actually? Yeah, there we go. A perspective where everything can be seen. Seeing everything means recognizing the ultimate fact that all things that exist are mutually connected into a single whole, even if the connections between them are not yet known to us. Seeing everything also means a completely different kind of responsibility for the world, because it's become obvious that every gesture here is connected to a gesture there, that a decision taken in one part of the world will have an effect on the another part, and that differentiating between mine and yours starts to be debatable. Nothing can be discounted by the tender narrator, because the assumption is that everything is important. The difference between the tender and a truly omniscient third-person narrator, though, lies in how much each one knows. The omniscient third-person narrator often knows the ending of a particular story and knows everything about the individual characters and their surroundings. But their knowledge ultimately ends at the end of the book. The story becomes self-contained, a closed work, and the narrator's horizon ends on the final page. I mean, to give you an example of this, I often end up teaching Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And there's this sort of opening at the very end where the narrator says, and then Raskolnikov goes off and he finds God. It's good. But there's a way in which you can doubt that narrator's knowledge there. That we don't really know what Raskolnikov is going to do. And the narrator's knowledge really does end at this very final moment. And so that is still a very closed text. Their knowledge ends in that moment. But the tender narrator, on the other hand, does not have complete knowledge, nor believes that she does. Her knowledge is complete in the sense of knowing that there are connections, but it is not total, because the way those connections work relies on the unending collaboration between the narrator and the reader. The tender narrator acknowledges her fragmentary knowledge, but this is not a flaw, but an asset, since it allows for continuing collaboration between that reader and author. An unending story, one constantly evolving from reader to reader, reaching beyond the covers of the novels themselves. The tender narrator is also not the only narrator in the story, just the guiding force. In each of her constellation novels, there are more than one narrator, but the one that introduces the set of story is this distanced, uninterested narrator, or what Tokarczuk dubs the fourth person narrator. The way that I understand this position is that the narrator who organizes the other set of narrators, the one who stands outside of the worldly interests of each other narrator, outside of the space and time of the novel, and even of the world itself. I think this is actually why she uses a biblical metaphor here, because the Old Testament is famously filled with lots of different narrators. There's actually lots of different folks that are narrating this story. But we kind of have the presumption that there is a reason for all of it to be together, and that idea, that this sort of assumption behind that, is what allows us to think of this as having a fourth-person narrator. And Tokarczuk encourages the fragments of the novel to extend beyond the novel itself into the real world by including non-fictional elements. In House of Day, House of Night, for example, she includes a lengthy description of the local saint, Kumarnis of Szolnau, probably based on a guide from the chapel dedicated to her in Wambierzyce, a village not far from Tokarczuk's own home in Lower Silesia. However, the narrator does not, and it's actually sort of set off in the text itself. It has like a different font, and it really does look like those little pamphlets that you would get at these kind of local chapels. But the narrator does not leave the story at its non-fictional state, because she dedicates several sections to Paschalis, the author of the story of Coumernis. So it says, you have this story, and then it's signed as, this is written down by Paschalis. And then at one point, the narrator is talking to her neighbor, and the neighbor says, well, but who wrote that story? And so the narrator then makes up this whole story about that narrator. And this imaginative step is the key to Tokarczuk's form of the tender narrator, as she imagines the lives of the people who created the stories before us, showing the reader why they constructed stories in a particular way, how they imbue that story with themselves, while also crafting the story itself. The tenderness of this narrator lies in how she imagines the other narrators doing so without judgments or complete knowledge of their motivations. And we also see this in flights, for example. This is the story of somebody who's somewhat like Tokarczuk herself, who's traveling around, she's going to museums, she finds things, and then she thinks to herself, I wonder what this person was actually like. And then she kind of goes off on an aside about who that person actually might have been. So this is how we get into this whole discourse on the Dutch anatomist who found the Achilles tendon, because she's at an exhibit that was started by him. And then she thinks, well, what was he actually kind of like? Why was he thinking about this? And so we have this sort of digression goes through that element. With both the tender narrator and the constellation novel, Tokarczuk reveals the power of narrative to misinterpret the world, while also presenting an alternative construction to it. The first-person narratives that have proliferated of late do not adequately describe the world because we are not alone and part of a larger set of actors. Our story should no longer focus exclusively on us, but rather include us in the larger story of the world, or perhaps merely of our community. The boundary between my story and yours should break down, revealing a new set of stories created collaboratively between and with me and you, one that we continually renew through the act of creation. I've largely concentrated on Tokarczuk's constellation novels as this way of exhibiting non-narrativity, but she's by no means alone in opposing narrative. She comes from a long line of Central European authors who have crafted distinctly non-narrative constructions of time, as I trace in this book project against narrative. This line for me begins with the fragmentary writings of Rainer Marie Rilke, continues through the anecdotal and essayistic histories of Jaroslav Hašek and Robert Musil, the episodic constructions of Selfhood and Bruno Schulz and Dezső Kosztolányi, the dueling emigre imaginings of Gombrowicz and Kundera, and the collage forms with spectral traces in Bohumil Hrabal and Peter Esterházy, up to the present day with Tokarczuk. There are certainly other authors who have defied narrativity, and here I would point to folks like Roberto Bolaño, David Foster Wallace, and Julien Gracq as prime examples. But I think Central Europe actually does have a specific set of historical and cultural reasons for its distrust of narrative. Tokarczuk herself draws a connection between non-narrativity and the Central European experience of history. In a lecture delivered in 2008, just after the release of Flights in Poland, Tokarczuk drew a distinction between the Central European historical experience and that of Western Europe. And she claims, and this is a section I'm actually deeply grateful to Ricardo Ogura of the Cairo University for her getting me this citation. In Western Europe, there is an understanding of history and historical continuity that differs from ours. What is important for our sensitivity to receive such processes in a manner that differs from others. That process is not a chain, but full of holes and discontinuity, a flow of chaos where causes do not necessarily lead to effects. In the historical perception of Central Europe, there's a lot of random chance. That in turn is reflected in the writing of the novel. I can say that such a way of writing is very closest to me. It is a completely different approach to storytelling. Such a narrative is scattered and non-linear and is revealed as a type of paradox. Chance itself is a driving force for events. I believe the preference for the fragmentary nature associated with the narratives of Central Europe writers is stronger than among writers in any other place. And in this, Tokarczuk shows that this experience of history is something that leads to a certain type of novelistic understanding, a certain type of novel writing. And this leads to a different narratological understanding of the world. Central Europe becomes for Tokarczuk the land of fragments. And I have to somewhat agree here that the experience of history in Central Europe over the past 2 centuries does not lead to a strong narrative. Central and Eastern Europeans have had to reorganize their temporal horizons with each successive political change in the region. from empire to nation state, from fascist dictatorship to the dictatorship of the proletariat, from the exuberance of democratic revolution to so many contemporary illiberal democracies, just to name a few. These changes not only shifted their larger historical horizons, but also the sources of identity available to the people in this heterogeneous region. Because each successive regime demanded that its narrative of history be obeyed, I am not surprised that authors began to reject narrative as such, instead of just wanting to replace one narrative with another. For me, this shows that the narrative understanding that is advocated by Ricoeur, Bruner, and Taylor actually comes from a privileged position, from those privileged enough to be actors in their own stories, who have not had to face the devastation of war or any other calamity that disrupted their understanding of the world and themselves. Even James Phelan, that great narratologist who I mentioned earlier, agrees with the narrative that a narrative description of selfhood is not accurate. He writes, in my youth, well before I read Henry James's The Beast in the Jungle, I had the not uncommon diachronic faith that the events in my life were preparing me to fulfill a great destiny. A few experiences of life's random violence disabused me of this illusion, and rather than replacing it with another more plausible diachronic narrative, I came to see my life in episodic terms. Phelan's use of the phrase great destiny, I think, is telling, as the narrative construction relies around such great destinies, based on the biographies that we read and hear about, where everything falls into perfect narrative form. But few people actually experience life that way. And for those that have either experienced life's random violence or have been tossed about on the stormy seas of history, another option had to be developed. And this is precisely what I think occurred in Central Europe, from Rilke's fragments to Tokarczuk's constellation novels. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much for this feast of textual references and of ideas about storytelling. It gives us a lot to think about. The last thing your book clearly needs is any more characters. But I want to, I don't know, start a conversation to ask you to relate to the topic you presented, a couple of sort of big topics in literary studies from beyond our beloved region. And one would be the Nouveau Roman. Is this not the, one of the most well-known in the Western world attempts to confront a similar idea about the inadequacy of conventional narrative? And if so, does that have offspring in Central Europe? And second thing, maybe less interesting or important, but just wondering, a lot of what you say brings to mind, the ideas that we associate with postmodernism about the end of grand narratives, and whether there's a role for that aspect of discourse in what you're saying.
Good. So I think the Nouveau Roman is quite interesting here, and we can think about this also as coming up at the same time in history as the Annales School. And I think it's not a coincidence that we see both of these coming up at the same time, but roughly in France in the 1950s or so. And although on the one hand, there is a lot of similarity here in the way that the Nouveau Roman was debating whether narratives can actually do this kind of work, I think for them it was mostly an aesthetic form as opposed to one based around ethics. And it's more of a formalistic rejection of narrative as opposed to one that is saying, well, we need to find something else to kind of mimic and understand what the world is actually like. And so this is why I think what's going on in Central Europe is a little bit different than what's going on in France at the same time.
They maybe have a common root in an uncertainty about knowledge.
Certainly uncertainty about knowledge, but again, the kind of ethical element of what's going on in Central Europe, I think, is a little bit different. And also just facing, a different set of circumstances. France in that time was, reeling from the Second World War, but it was also, there was also sort of a sense of hope that France could establish a new way going forward. And it was being a part of this kind of new world order at that time. Whereas if we look at what's going on in Central Europe, there's a lot more worry anxiety,
Uncertainty.
about uncertainty, if you will.
Yeah.
So I do think that that's a major problem. The Indo-Grand narratives is one very much important that we have had this debate about what kind of postmodernism does with the Indo-Grand narratives. But as I've gotten older, I think I disagree with Lyotard more and more.
Okay.
It's simply that I'm not sure that the grand narratives have ended.
Okay.
I'm just not actually convinced that we have lost our grand narratives. If anything, they seem to be being reified every day. And that I find to be really distressing. I feel much more at home in a world with, without grand narratives. But as I've, grown, I see more and more of them. And it's hard not to see them around.
So we're not there yet.
No, I don't think we are. I think this was. I think what Lyotard was responding to was a rejection in particular of or a critique and debate around the progress narrative and the loss of true religious narratives.
Mm.
And although the time and place when he was writing that, interestingly enough, he delivered those lectures in Montreal at the University of Montreal. But this was in the 1970s when there was a very different kind of circumstance. And I think since then we've seen a rise of grand narratives again. And even since the end of the Cold War, there's an idea that, it's not quite the end of history per se, but there was an idea that we would be on this kind of unending progress, that progress had won, that we were going to get more and more democratic. We would get more and more free as life was going on. But getting more and more free sounds awfully Hegelian to me. And what is more teleological than the Hegelian approach to history? So I'm not entirely sure that we have lost our grand narratives.
Well, it's a lot more I'd love to weigh in on particular authors, both in your book and not in your book yet. But I want to open it up to our audience, both here in the room and to those of you following us online.
Yes, thank you. It was a fantastic talk, and I learned so much. And I'm a historian and the history department here at Columbia of East Central Europe. So history department in Columbia is placed in social sciences. So we are positivistic science. So we definitely try to control narratives in a positivistic or neo-positivistic way, and actually hold it as sort of a badge of honor that we are different than humanities. And it's just a sort of spirit of the place. I'm not saying that what is my position, but there's definitely what you are saying, that there is something really disconcerting about entropy or fragmentation of narratives that can be also very problematic. I have, I think, two questions, but it's been so inspiring. I think the big question is, if you look at Central Europe philosophy, science, stuff, total history of culture, starting with the 19th century onwards, you have Nietzsche, right? Perspectivism, right? There's only one way of seeing, one way of looking at things, but if there is anything like control over reality is to control multitude of narratives. This is what Nietzsche is striving for, right? So he acknowledges the multitude of narratives, but he believes that it's still important to control them, which is a very different, I think it's still different from tender narrator.
It is.
Because I think Tokarczuk tries to dominate at any point, right? She wants any form of dominance to dissolve in this sort of you and me in betweenness, right? I think so. That's a sort of a different frequency in which Tokarczuk operates, as opposed to Nietzsche, if you just think about these two thinkers, right? But there is basically a long tradition between them, right? of deep conviction that you cannot really, that entropy is part of life, anomie is part of life, fragmentation is what we are at. And the God is dead, obviously. No, I think it can't. And yet, so I want to ask you that if we should just, thinking from East Central Europe, get rid of idea of postmodernism at all, because we all know it as Central Europeans, right? That there is no need to postmodernism from the point of view of Central European culture. Like, it's just a question because I don't know the debates about postmodernism as a sort of like, like humble positivist historian, I have no clue. But I'm just curious how what is going on in your field about does thinking in terms of postmodernism even makes sense from the sort of anti-narrativist perspective that you investigate and develop further. And this second question is about the context in which you place all this, because I think who controls the narrative is so important in Central Europe, and I think this is what Tokarczuk points at. She's like anti-authoritarian in her approach, and I think that's what is at stake. But the real enemy of episodists, right, are not Western strong narrativists, but strong narrativists at home, right? The church, like textbooks that you have to, read at school, right? These are all like strong narratives that right? Those writers grapple with. And I think I would not dismiss strong narrative, as you say, because they are important in the world of fragmentation. You need strong narratives too. And so, like, how to be a socially smart tender narrator, right? It's also a question, right? Because you just don't want to say, oh, we want to be in this kind of diluted liberal amoebic zone. Because it's really important, right? Because if there is a war, you need to know on which side you are. Right? It's an existential predicament in that part of Europe too, right? So taking sides is what people do all the time, and we don't have the luxury of not taking sides. And so, okay, sorry for sorry.
This is great. This gets at a bunch of things that are at the heart of this work. And I'll start with the first part in thinking about the problem of power, really, is part of what we're talking about here, is that the strong narratives are often used to create power. And there's something very attractive about narratives. And look, I'm attracted to them too. I like to think of my own life in narrative. I like to think of, I'm here, this is where I want to get. How do I get there? I act in a certain way in order to get there at the end. This is creating a narrative. And this is very comforting. And in some ways, the narrative itself can be extraordinarily comforting. Doesn't mean it's right though. And that's where the problem comes in, is that narratives are seductive. And the strong narratives that you're right, that Tokarczuk is rebelling against, are the ones that, and in particular, one of the ones that many of the authors I look at are trying to combat is the narrative of nationalism and these very sort of problematic nationalistic narratives. And the problem here is that to combat that, one way to do it is by just creating a different narrative of saying, well, that's not actually who we are. I can think about the Polish context here. One of the sort of old jokes I used to, talk about is you can tell a lot about a person if you ask a Polish person, what is the greatest moment in their history? And if they start talking about, say, the multicultural era of, the post-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it's a very different time than someone who talks about, the Battle of Warsaw or the Warsaw Uprising. There's a very different constructs about what it means to be Polish. And depending on where you mark those sort of high points, that's going to tell a lot about who you actually are as a person. What kind of narrative you think you participate in is going to tell you a lot about what you actually are. So we have these disparate narratives, but those disparate narratives, and I think this is why Tokarczuk rebels against the first person, create this sort of us versus them context. Or it creates this atomization, where you have, I'm in my narrative, you're in yours, you're in yours, you're in yours, and we're not ever going to actually meet anywhere. And that's one of the other problems with the narrative construction. And this is why I think what she's trying to do here is create something that is not atomizing and not a strong version of narration, but something completely different. And instead of thinking about this as just a sort of postmodern play or something that's just, kind of out there and being sort of strange and it's for its own right. It actually is an attempt to create a new foundational understanding for us in the world. And that's a much bigger and much more radical stance than I think people have given Tokarczuk credit for. So I would say it's even a bigger thing here. But this again does relate back to this problem of power. And I think power is at the heart of all of this, so that how we define what those narratives are is a claim to power. And this gets us back to this problem of the will to power from Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche on the one hand is perhaps the most narrativistic of anybody. I mean, in some ways, the whole point of Zarathustra, he talks about this, is to change and so it happened, so like the accidental world, into a thus I willed it. In other words, it's my power, my agency over the world. And that is basically saying I am an agent, not someone who is being acted upon. That is me becoming the narrative, sort of both the author and hero of my own narrative, which conflict of interest there, right? That can be a really dangerous thing. And yet on the other hand, late Nietzsche gets into this idea of will to power, which is really, I think, complicated. And this is where I think that the Deleuzian tract of Nietzschean interpretation becomes really important, where the will to power is no longer about just me. It's about my relationship to you. That the will to power actually exists in this moment where you and I are together. There's always that sort of vibration that you have with every kind of individual. Every time we get together as people, the thing that happens between us is actually the most important. It's not the me or the you, it's actually the thing between. And that interpretation of the will to power, I think, then resonates a lot more with what Tokarczuk is trying to do, where this idea of the dissolving of the me and you becomes this idea about what is the us together, what is the thing that ties us. And creating that space, I think, is what the Constellation novel is actually about. And this is why it doesn't end at the covers. It's actually I think she's actively trying to teach us to read the world through this idea of the constellation. And so it's not supposed to end at the end of the novel. It's supposed to then be something that we carry forward and we use in our world. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. I realize that's huge, right? Those are really big, heady ideas, but I do think that that's actually what Tokarczuk's trying to do.
Jennifer.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Helenick, and I'm a master's student here at the Harriman Institute. I specialize in East Central Europe.
Fantastic.
And your talk made me want to go reread so many books and think of them in the context of this discourse. I was thinking about the opening of David Copperfield and saying, whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own story or whether that station will be occupied by someone else, these pages will show that type of framing. Right. But I was especially thinking of one of my favorite books, Don Quixote. And I was wondering where, I love thinking of Don Quixote when people say that it's not just the first Western novel, but it's also potentially the first postmodern novel. I think there's a strong argument to be made for that. And I was wondering where this fits into your discourse in terms of an episodic novel, this structure that's also has main characters and it is linear, but it's so fragmented and so digressive. And I think this would actually help me a lot in terms of understanding the whole structure of what you're saying. Fantastic. I'm glad you brought up Don Quixote. This is a great example of it. And we could have picked a bunch of other ones as well, like Tristram Shandy, a lot of these sort of early works that are effectively, we could almost call them postmodern. But this is a picaresque. And one of the great things about the picaresque is that it is episodic. And in fact, what this shows us is that the strong narrative and perception of literature is really a recent thing. It's only really the late 18th century into the 19th century being the really strong period of narrative. And then into the 20th century, we start to see this kind of break down. We start to see it change. And so this reliance on narrative is not historically accurate. Like, that's not actually what we've been doing for ages in terms of literature. It's only a very small self-contained era. So much of earlier literature is just not narrative. I mean, it's weak. And Don Quixote is a great example of a weak narrative. But look at the way that Don Quixote gets taken up and retold. Whenever we do a retelling of Don Quixote, they try to put a strong narrative on it. So the musical, The Man of La Mancha, has a strong narrative, but the original doesn't. And in some ways, this is the correction that modernity is making to it, is it's trying to make it into the strong one, because we sort of have this
will to narrative. And, if you will, exactly. And so there, I think we come up against the problem of our contemporary era, when we are really obsessed with narrativizing all of this.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question that combines sort of your question, that was a perfect example, and the second question you asked, but I still would like an answer to, and I'm a student from Harriman, I think 12 years ago.
Okay.
So it's very wonderful to do that for the first time, like, since pre-pandemic.
Welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back.
I
always love
work for a narrative organization.
Oh.
You know, we see ourselves as like one of the original narrative organizations, a nonprofit for progressive, pro-democratic narratives in the US. And there's a huge trend right now of nonprofits hiring a narrative expert.
Yeah.
I've been recruited as a narrative expert. So I'm just like,
And not just nonprofits, a lot of really deeply evil businesses.
Yeah.
Exactly
Yep.
that, because as you say, we live in it, just a minute, you know. But as a real writer and academic, I'm constantly punching holes in this whole idea. And basically our business is to replace a current narrative that we see as a really destructive dominant narrative with a more progressive, more democratic narrative. So it is
Yep.
the war of narratives.
Yep.
So this is fascinating, and having not read any of her work, I do wonder, narrative tells us how to live. It tells us how to govern, us being like sort of citizens. It also kind of tells what is right and wrong, which side of the conflict to sit in. And yeah, it's not always based in truth. There's
Yeah.
comfort and meaning.
Uh-huh.
So this more episodic truth that, there are these constellations of truths, and there's other people we're not considering, other voices we haven't heard. That completely blows up that sort of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
Can we, and if, the goal is, whether it's Central Europe or America, where I'm seeing similar things happen, can we, the goal is to move ahead to a better form of governance, peace, society. Can we do that through this new sort of approach, or will we ultimately just have to come back to narratives, because as humans we crave that?
I mean, I hope so.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I don't know. This is where I can't really give you a good answer. Narratives are powerful and they are strong. And one of the problems is that this joke that I threw in there about never let the facts get in the way of a good story seems more and more accurate every day. That this is what we do. And in fact, one of the things that I often see is that in certain stories that we tell ourselves, there are certain kind of key things, and we're unwilling to ever change them. And that means that we're unwilling to change the narrative, and it means that we're unwilling to face any other kind of reality. But I think there's something deeply negative about that. I think that this allows us, this prevents us from moving forward. That, in other words, that narratives themselves can make us into more violent, more antagonistic people, and that they're not always in the service of good. And the authors that I'm trying to look at, and what I think they do, is not just challenge a specific narrative, or even just challenge narrative, but they're actually trying to put something else forward. They're trying to say that here's a different way. And I hope that we can actually learn. I hope that we can really think through what these other ways can be and what they are, so they can be more pluralistic, more open, and less rigid. But this is, I don't know. I don't know. It depends. You can ask me one day and I'll say, yes, this is definitely going to happen. Another day I'll turn around and say, I'll despair and say, no, we are stuck in a world of narratives. And try as I might and yell as I might from my, perch in the ivory tower, not much will change.
Yes.
I'll echo everyone else. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about Tokarczuk's training as a psychoanalyst, and especially in reference to the rhizome and Deleuze you cited already. Do you think that when you talk about her advocating for us to read the world in a new way, that that's still rooted in some kind of psychoanalytic understanding of the subject, or is she advocating for a more like schizoanalytic complete application of the self in order to move beyond?
So she was more kind of classically trained in terms of psychoanalysis, and came up under, she was trained as a psychologist under communism, which is already kind of interesting in its own right, because most Marxists are opposed to Freud, and so you have this kind of problem of Marx and Freud being in kind of at odds with each other. And she did practice for a little bit in Lower Silesia, and then by 1994, had quit practicing and had dedicated herself to being a writer full time. But what exactly she studied in terms of psychology, I can't tell you. She seems to have somewhat closed the door on that. And although there are a lot of critics who try to really imbue her work with psychoanalysis, I'm a little bit reluctant to do so, just because I think that she's moved beyond some of that. I like the way that Palov puts it, where she's kind of informed by this, informed by listening and what listening means. I think that's actually a really powerful insight. But how much more psychology there is, I'd actually argue there's not even that much. That she actually doesn't try to psychoanalyze her characters. She leaves them. There's one character who's really a kind of abhorrent individual in House of Day, House of Night. But she never kind of goes in and says, this is really who he is. She lets him be a little bit mysterious, lets him be just kind of there. And that, I think, is a really powerful thing, that she wants to allow us to be mysterious, not easily understood through psychoanalysis, for there to be this core of what it means to be us, but it's never something that can be easily teased out, even with the use of psychoanalysis. So maybe something in between.
Can I just add one
Yeah.
word? I think she studied psychology, not psycho. It was not the time of like today's psychotherapy. So I think it was also more connected to social policy, like working with people with addictions,
Yeah.
So I think this is the classical training of psychologists. It was not Marxist at all, maybe.
Right.
But I don't know too much about it. I would say that in the 1970s, you have an emergence of psychotherapy in communist Poland that was very much related to like big cities, Polish intelligentsia, and they were Buddhist very often. That was very alternative circle. That is with the history is very interesting, but I would say that there is some kind of element of Buddhism in Tokarczuk.
Yeah, I would too. I mean, her parents are also really interesting. They were kind of hippie communists, and they worked for this the humanitarian university out in Lower Silesia, which was a little bit more of this again, kind of like a hippie communist version of it. And so they had moved out there. They weren't originally from that area. And that's where she grew up in this somewhat utopian hippie intellectual milieu.
My native language is Russian. I was affiliated with Harriman years ago. I'm myself suffering. I'm a poet suffering to kind of pass into the prose writer. So it's very, very interesting for me. Thank you. I'm a psychoanalyst. So I'll try to answer this question maybe from the point of view of trauma.
Okay.
Of course, episodic, entropy, fragmentation. This is all the very much post-traumatic feelings. And I think that her kind of anti-narrative or multiplicity of narratives, equality of them, in a way is kind of after the explosion. And this is how I see how she writes, how she thinks. And I think that's very, very important that somebody like her or somebody at all is talking about that on this level of thinking, feeling, about the world. I also was thinking about the interview I read in Le Monde this summer in two weekend issues by Mikhail Shishkin, this Russian writer, whose main idea was he lives in Switzerland and he writes sometimes in German also. And he writes huge, enormous novels, like 800 pages. And his main idea was that he doesn't want to write anymore in the language of the killer, right? So
Good luck finding the right language for that.
Yeah.
and I was thinking from a literary point of view that a kind of Russian literature was pretending being such a humanist big narrative.
Yeah.
Right, and we cannot kind of completely delete it from the history, but you know, like in my own experience, I think that when I started writing feminist texts in the world, I became a persona non grata, right, 25 years ago. Then now it is such a following of young feminist writers, and also the theory of identity and the small nations, small languages, you know, alternative narratives in the national narratives. It was such a popular thing after the Perestroika in the 90s. Where are they?
Yeah.
Right? So I think that she's an amazing writer in terms of, you know, she's a carrier of history in a way. After the explosion, you know, like the ancient.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting that you bring up trauma. This is something I thought about a lot, because there is a theory in some treatment for PTSD in particular, that the only way to kind of get over it is to narrativize it. And one of the therapies that people developed was to effectively make people tell the story again and again and again. It was only once we incorporated into the story that we're able to heal. And so this betrays, though, again, the narrative principle, that if we don't have a narrative about it, then we are somehow flawed. There's something wrong with us. More recently, though, there's actually been another school developing, which says, I actually have more than one self. There is my war self, and there's my peacetime self. And these are different. And there are different worlds, there are different circumstances. And it's okay for me to say, these are different. These are not the same person, and these are not the same things. And that's actually saying an episodic form. And that's advocating for this episodic. And so I think it's really interesting that even in psychology right now, we're moving away, or at least from a unambiguously or equivocably narrative position. And it's all coming out of this kind of trauma studies. But so I think that this notion of trauma is a really important one for us to think about, and why maybe fragmentation can be healthy even. And this is one of the points I'm trying to sort of advocate for, is that the notion that we are fragments, or that we contain all these different sort of fragments together, we don't need to look at that as a bad thing. It's a re-evaluation of that idea. And instead saying, actually, maybe that's actually the normal condition. Maybe the narrative is actually the rare one, and the fragmentation is the much more normal. I mean, that's the way it actually works. And in terms of Russian literature, one of the things I keep coming back to is actually Tolstoy. Because Tolstoy kind of rejects certain types of narratives. And I think about this and say, even Anna Karenina, where what is the problem that Anna faces? Anna wants to make her life like a novel. She wants to live as if she were in a novel named Anna Karenina. And this is the kind of irony of the text itself. But the hero of it, and just to a certain degree, is not Anna, it's Levin. And Levin then becomes this less narrative structure, not narrative, but at least less narrative. So you have this opposition there between Anna, who wants to live in this narratological form, versus Levin, who's sort of like, I have no idea what's going on, and kind of stumbles through the world. And then that's kind of the way that he works. And we see this even more so in Tolstoy's opposition to history and great man history in War and Peace. And so I think both of those are kind of pointing in this direction. Even if we have, quite possibly the greatest narrativist of all time in some ways is Tolstoy as well. So it's this kind of
most authoritarian narrator of all time, maybe.
Oh,
one of them.
yeah, I was gonna say, Nabokov, I think, has some beats,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, I think there's this interesting line in Tolstoy there. And then finally, you mentioned the writing feminist poetry. I think there's actually a long line of the écriture féminine that also applies to this, where we have an idea that, and in some of the criticism, the idea of a strong narrative is actually phallologocentrism.
Yes.
And effectively the same thing. And so you can have this opposition that is a non masculine figuration of temporality and agency, and that's actually a really important. I mean, Adrienne Cabrera, who I disagree with on certain points, has kind of made this idea where she advocates for still a narrativist position, but a narrative that is collaboratively developed. And so even in that moment, that move is one that is aligned with this idea of écriture.
I have many thoughts. I just want to say one thing, that to allow to repeat narratives in narrative therapy came from the patient who has to repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. So let's allow this person to repeat, so we made it. But it's also interesting about several cells. The aggressiveness of self, it was from the early times before Freud.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So aggressiveness in hunger, in sex, and in war, of course. So the positivism of history, I condolences.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for really interesting talk what everyone said. I'm sorry if this is a very naive question, but I'm interested in, obviously you situated the author into this longer tradition of rejection of the narrative. And history keeps coming up in the questions and whether it's Hayden White, Pinal School, Tolstoy. And how much is this being picked up by historians, I guess, in this wider rejection of these grand narratives? I know we've had these narrative shifts within the region, etc. Or is it just not being picked up and actually how big changing in our history?
I want to make a strong distinction here between the history that people like Rainer is doing versus the kind of history that is often sort of put out there by sort of public history, if I can, like the kind of historical narratives that we kind of receive, whether they be sort of in textbooks or just in the speeches made by politicians, or the kind of ones that we just kind of carry with us. Because I think the history that professional historians are doing is much more complex. And it often is much more technical and is really trying to participate within a larger field where there are multiple stories. One of the great things about academic history is that you don't read one book, you actually read several. And so by being within the field of history, you are saying, well, I think this explains things better, but you're not working in a vacuum. There are lots of other narratives around. And so I think there is this kind of competition there that creates a much more varied, much more heteroglossic understanding of what history actually is. Whereas in this kind of public form, that's where we get more monovocal understandings of things. And so I want to make sure that that's fairly clear. No shade to the academic historians.
If I might be at a program more than a week ago, remembering our great historian István Deák, for his professorship is named, and almost all of the talks of explaining what was exceptional about his work was precisely essentially how it was picking apart at these kind of authoritarian narratives and showing how there was always something complicated and always something ironic and nothing predetermined in the way these things were happening. And he's not the only historian out there, but as someone who has many intellectual children and grandchildren, I think the idea of pursuing models that go against authoritarian strong narrative are being developed by a lot of good historians today.
And there still is a practice of using narratives, but again, I think the best professional historians are often breaking these down or existing on a different level, a much more complicated one. The ones that I worry about the most are the ones that also use historical analogy. This is where I think things get really messy, and I start to vociferously disagree when people say, well, this is exactly like this narrative that we know from history. When people say, oh, this is exactly like, what happened during the Second World War, which is the most famous one that gets constantly used. But that's a historical analogy that is basically taking one narrative and trying to apply it to the now. And that analogy of picking up that narrative and then applying it to the now rarely works, and is basically almost always being marshaled in the service of illiberalism, just to put it frankly. And so that's something that I have deep reservations and fears about. But again, I don't think that is what good professional historians do. I will sort of leave it dangling who might be the bad professional historians who do some of that work, but I'll just sort of leave it at that.
Chris, did you want to?
Yeah, sure, if I got time. Just a terminological question. You touched your talk anti-narrative. But I'm wondering if it's not narrative that you are arguing against, but a specific type of narrative, as we've said here so many times today. I think it seems that there's two positions. On one hand, you say anti-narrative, but what you mean by anti-narrative is anti-strong narrative.
Yes.
Because there are these sort of some of the terms that we've used with standard narratives, reformulated, great man narratives, dominant narratives, even authoritarian narratives, and so it seems actually that you're not anti-narrative at all. You're quite heavily invested in narrative, because as a matter of fact, Tokarczuk herself says, she doesn't say that we don't need to stop narrating the world. She says we need to find new narratives. And so in a sense, it's actually not anti-narrative. It's actually even more narrative than the narrativist. Because really, your main ideas are the tender narrator. So like, what does a tender narrator do if not narrate?
But without creating a strong narrative.
Well, exactly, but a strong narrative. But still a narrative. So it's all about weak narratives. As a matter of fact, you called Don Quixote a great example of a weak narrative. And you talked about collaborative narratives, narratives that put the responsibility onto the reader to form the narrative. You talked about series of narratives. So it seems to me that rather than present an anti-narrative position, you have simply presented a case for alternative forms of narrative.
So one can make this argument, and I would also say that yes, I am mostly against the strong narrative. It is also a punchier statement to say against narrative. So
it seems internally contradictory, because ultimately you're proposing new forms of narrative.
The problem though is that the slippage here amongst the narrativist position is really strong. That when they get challenged, they often go, well, he doesn't have to be the strong narrative, it can be this. But then it's when they want it to be the strong narrative, they let it be. And so if I'm against anything, it's people not defining narrative as strongly as they should. And being consistent.
Yeah, it's got a real ring to it.
Yeah, exactly.
And ultimately then it will be confusing when the question says we need new fables, we need new myths. I mean, what are those but narrative forms? So.
But again, I think that she's looking for the weak form of this. And look, Tokarczuk is an author, not a theorist at the end of the day. And so I'm going to forgive her a little bit of terminological slipperiness. And in my sort of attempt to sort of tease it out a little bit more, I think she is looking for the idea of the constellation novel, which is not a pure narrativist position.
Sure.
I mean, the other way to say this is that I'm against narrativists.
Okay.
There's your title. Right?
There we go.
Yes, narrativist.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Sash.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. It's a great talk, but I also enjoyed the discussion.
Yes.
There's so many topics. I find interesting what has been said also in discussion that we don't need a postmodern feminist in Europe. And I kind of want to like link that with your talk, because it seems to me that Tokarczuk is pretty much like this metaphysical writer about questions of being or ontological questions rather of modernist questions of what we can know, like epistemological questions. And that is something that I think you tied very well in your talk with this specific historical experience that is traumatic, full of changes, full of holes, not continuities, or continuities that work in weird ways, pick up things that are left 50 or 100 years ago. And topic of trauma is interesting because I think this notion of annihilation of being on one hand, or nothingness, or the void, is interesting in her case because she does work through what Lacan calls symptom. We cannot resolve symptom. It's always there. We have to, in order to heal, we have to go through the symptom. And you know, it's a void. It's not something that can be narrated, but we still have to go through it. And how to do that. And I think her conception of standard narrator is one of the answers, it seems to me. And I have a comment to your great question about how the developers of narratives, democratic narratives, could benefit from it, maybe through the notion of participatory engagement, because the meaning in these novels is a collaborative project between the reader, and the reader becomes the author. In the same way, if you can develop a narrative that invites for more participatory role of those who are listeners and consumers, that could be used as an option. But my question, to come back to the question after all this, like thinking about comments, is I like the series again that a colleague Chris mentioned, that you mentioned. The series is very interesting in a way it comes from the media, from television. And I'm thinking whether she herself was inspired by the media environment that the current writers find themselves in. You know, we browse through so many narratives or short stories, clips, TikToks, Instagrams, and whatnot, in order to make sense of us and the world around us, and how much that is connected to her writing. And another question I have is more skeptical, and is I see in this like wish to make new fables just another like impulse of the capitalist logic. There's no way out of capitalism, even in her own, you know, writing or contribution with tender narrative and everything.
So sort of three things here. First, I will go back to the postmodern statement, because Tokarczuk herself actually rejects the idea of being a postmodernist. And so she has come out and basically said, no, I'm not a postmodernist. That's not the kind of thing that I'm doing. And in particular, she rejected the idea that that much of this was just sort of play. And again, we have this idea that postmodernists are playing with form for no other reason than just playing with form. And that's the part that she very much rejected. Coming back to the idea of the media environment, I think that Tokarczuk is very much influenced by the media environment that we are all in. At the same time, I think that she's looking at this as all responding to the moment. That she and the series, the development of these series, are a response to our lived experience. That art is something that emerges from the particular social historical moment in which we find ourselves. It is something that is trying to make sense of the world around us. And this is one way that, say, you know, television and things are trying to do, whereas what she's trying to do is create this constellation novel and see if that works. And whatever will kind of take hold will be the thing that makes sense to us. I mean, in some ways, it's trying to make sense of our time, while also we as readers engage with it. And the more we engage with it, it usually means that we see it as doing a good job of describing whatever experience that we're having. So there's this sort of push and pull element to what I think is going on here. As for the new capitalist logic, this is something I've struggled with quite a bit. And you know, one of the things that I worried about was that this whole understanding of being non-narrative was effectively just replacing narratives with another form of power and another form of just oppression. And this is the kind of classic way, is that when we have a discourse, that discourse is maybe initially freeing, but then it becomes marshaled in the service of power again. And we see this repeated again and again and again and again. And so one of the questions here is, will any of this actually break that cycle? And on the one hand, the answer is probably not. Why in the world would it? We've had this thing happen so many times. Why would it happen again? But then I also have to pull the same skeptical logic there of Hume, who, after, spending his time thinking about whether the sun will rise again tomorrow, says, I don't know, but tonight I'll go play some pool and see what happens. and to a certain degree, I hope that Tokarczuk's, understanding here of the constellation is something that is free, that is liberatory. But maybe I just can't see the next horizon when it'll be used in the service of oppression. Maybe I'm still blind to that. But I also would be, given my position within time and space, that I wouldn't necessarily be able to see the future on that score. And again, I certainly won't narrativize it myself. Anything that to describe what the future will hold.
Yeah, I mean, there is a positive attitude in what you said about the responsibility, because it becomes like an ethical question. It's not forming identity on like I don't know, white male of this ethnicity and so on, but I am what I'm responsible for. And I mean that's like a promising start.
Right. And again, it's a kind of a shared understanding of this, that we are all connected and we're all within the system. But in some ways, this is the problem with some of the discourses that begin to use that are then used in the service of oppression, is that those discourses attempt to be outside the system itself. But if you begin from the perspective that you are always already within the system, that it is always already about you in relationships to others, then that power becomes revealed immediately. But again, maybe we'll get into a meta form that just reasserts it.
Well, I don't want to end this conversation, but I think it's maybe a good moment to end the formal part of our conversation and to once again thank our speaker, Daniel Pratt. Yep, I encourage you to buttonhole him now with your individual questions. And and take advantage of him being here this fall.
Yeah.